Rebbe Marash is the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, and his birthday is Wednesday. It's one of the great ironies of the Hasidic calendar that the first day you say Tachnun after 32 or 33 days is the birthday of the Rebbe Marash. From Rosh Chodesh Nisan until Rosh Chodesh Iyar, including the Rosh Chodesh Iyar, there's no Tachnun. So that's 32 days, 31 days. What's the first time we say Tachnun? The birthday of the Rebbe Marash. Every year when it comes to the Rebbe Marash's birthday, I say, there's something wrong, you know. We didn't say Tachnun the whole month. Today we start. Today, the Rebbe Marash's birthday, we're going to start saying Tachnun. But that's the way the cookie crumbles, as they say. That's the reality. That's what we do. Rosh Chodesh, Beis Iyar, the birthday of the Rebbe Marash, we say Tachnun. The Rebbe Marash was a very interesting man. Now, all the Rebbeim are interesting people, but first of all, they're very different personalities. A Rebbe serves God, period. A Rebbe is a servant of God, that's what he is, right? We serve a Rebbe, but the whole power of the Rebbe is not his greatness, but his submission to the Rebbe. A Rebbe is very great, extremely great, but what makes him a Rebbe is not how great he is, but he's totally bottled Hashem. The whole material of a Rebbe to serve Hashem, and that's why when we serve a Rebbe, we are really also serving the Eibishter. That's the concept. So they're all doing exactly the same thing, but the personalities of the Rebbeim are very distinctive. They're so very, very different. I mean, it's very hard to find two Rebbes that are so closely connected that are more different than the Rebbe Marash and his son, the Rebbe Rashab. They were opposites, mamish. It's a father and a son. The Rebbe Marash had an older son whose name was Reb Zalman Aaron, who a lot of people thought should have been a Rebbe. Reb Zalman Aaron had the personality of the Rebbe Marash. The Rebbe Rashab had the very opposite personality, and the Rebbe Rashab was the Rebbe and Reb Zalman Aaron was the Chassid. The Rebbe Marash is a very interesting man, and as you can expect of a real person, in his personhood, so many contradictory concepts exist. The Rebbe Marash is so interesting. He's the only Rebbe conceived and born when his father was already a Rebbe. The Rebbe Marash was born to Machon was already a Rebbe, which means that the holiness of the neshama. Imagine your father is a Rebbe, not later. He was already the Rebbe when the Rebbe Marash was born. And there's a lot of such fascinating things about his personality. The Rebbe always said about the Rebbe Marash, Melechatchila Rebbe. That was not a slogan, let me tell you. It was his whole life. The Rebbe Marash was afraid of nothing and no one, period. The Rebbe Marash was so bold. He was so over the top. More than, he was like the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was that way, you know. Baal Shem Tov was afraid of nothing. Baal Shem Tov means the most powerful guy in the world, and you look through the guy like a laser, and the guy would, the Rebbe Marash, Baal Shem Tov was not afraid. He owned the world. In Golus. The Rebbe Marash, his personality was the same way. From childhood. When the Rebbe Marash was a little kid, he had enough confidence for 1,000 men. You would think he's the world's biggest Baal guy, but he wasn't. He was just so unafraid. As a little kid, as a baby, he showed a strength of character and a fearlessness that's extraordinary. And his whole life was that way. The Rebbe Marash was never afraid of anything. The Rebbe would say all the time, the Rebbe Marash, one of the interesting characteristics, the Rebbe Marash, first of all, was a very, very sick man, physically. He was a very sick man. In the Rebbe's journal, of the Rebbe's Rishimis, it says that as a young man, he was very sick. Somebody told me that he had leukemia, cancer. He took him the 1830s, 1850s, I don't know how you cure that. He was very, very, very sick. And he didn't tell his father. He didn't tell Tzemach Tzedek. Because he didn't want to hurt his father. He didn't upset his father. He was prepared to die, that his father shouldn't know about his illness. Which is another side of his character, you know. The Rebbe Marash was his own worst enemy. I don't have a lot of time, but if I'll have a chance, I'll tell you what I mean by that. Reb Marash caused himself so much trouble because he never was a man of principle. If he were a little bit less principled, his life would have been much better. I'll explain it to you soon. But he was very, very, very sick. His father found out by mistake. By the time his father found out, he was extremely sick. And the Tzemach Tzedek got very upset and said, why didn't you tell me? If you would have told me, I could have helped you. And now we're sort of so far along in the illness. And he said, Zol chotch zayin v'Shmuel HaNavi. At least you should live as long as Shmuel HaNavi. Shmuel HaNavi lived 52 years. The Reb Marash didn't live 48. But he said, Zol chotch, in other words, by the time, Shmuel HaNavi was the same name, Shmuel. By the time the Tzemach Tzedek became aware of the illness of the Reb Marash, the illness was so advanced that the miracles required was so great that the Tzemach Tzedek says, had I known sooner, I could have helped you more. But that's part of who he was. He wasn't going to burden his father. He was going to suffer. He could have lost his life. He was not going to tell us. His father found out by mistake. And later in life, I'm sure you know, the Marash was extremely fat, extremely heavy. People say there's a photo of the Rebbe Marash. People say we have that photo. I have on my computer a picture which is officially the Rebbe Marash. Looks exactly like the Frierdiker Rebbe, spitting image of the Frierdiker Rebbe. But people say it's known that the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe Marash looked exactly alike. There was a chassid from the Rebbe Marash who took a look at the Frierdiker Rebbe and he fainted. Because as soon as the Frierdiker Rebbe saw the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe must have told that story 20 times. Every single time, you could take it to the bank. Every time the Rebbe told that story, he would cry. That someone saw the Frierdiker Rebbe and he fainted because he saw the Rebbe Marash. So there is a photo which is officially the Rebbe Marash, which is available. If you'll Google it, you can find it. And you think it's the Frierdiker Rebbe, just the payas are a little wider. But when I was growing up, the rumor was that there's a picture of the Rebbe Marash and they're not publicizing it because he was so heavy, he was so fat that he doesn't look good. I don't buy that for a second. I don't believe that for a moment. I believe the reason the picture was not revealed, assuming it exists, was because the Rebbeim decided it's none of our business. But the Rebbe was extremely heavy because he had terrible metabolic problems. He had a lot of illnesses. He was sick all the time. There's a story which is really upsetting. He was a mesurbal lebasar. He had layers, and he sweat a lot. He perspired, so the sweat is an acid. It burned away his skin. So between the layers of fat, you had raw flesh. You understand? His sweat is salty. He sweat so much that it burnt off the flesh. So he was in constant pain. And another one of the characters of the Rebbe Marash, this is before the days of the control of the FDA, the Rebbe Marash used to make his own drugs. He would go to the pharmacy and buy raw materials and mix his own drugs. The Rebbe Marash studied medicine. The Rebbe Marash knew everything. He just knew everything. He studied Latin, he studied medicine, and he would go to the pharmacist and not buy a drug. He'd buy raw. Today you do that, you go to jail for 100 years. And he would mix his own medicines. So the story is told that he woke up his shamish in the middle of the night. And he says to the shamish, I'm going to do something, okay? But promise me you won't faint. He tells the shamish, promise me you won't faint. Sure. And he tells him in Yiddish, Ich lufheben und du wirst anschmieren. I'm going to raise the layers and you'll put on the ointment, because he was in excruciating pain. So he raised up the first layer. The shamish saw what was going on and he fainted on the spot. So the Rebbe Marash had to first put the shamish back to bed, then he had to do it himself. He was in so much physical pain, it's indescribable, his whole life. And he always had a smile. Always had a smile. And what was weird about the Rebbe Marash smile, if you looked in your direction, you began to shake, Pashut, from fear. Goyim! Wherever the Rebbe Marash eyes touched, you became afraid and you didn't understand why. There's a nice smile on his face. The power of the man was extraordinary. Now, but just to give you another side of this Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Marash was such a Isha Emes, he was so humble. The Rebbe Marash was the youngest of 7 sons, okay? But the youngest sons, he had a whole minion of nephews and nieces older than him. His oldest siblings were born in the 1800s, in 1805, 1806, 1807. He was born in 1834. He was 30 years younger than his oldest siblings, close to 30 years younger. They were married. They got married as teenagers. He had nephews and nieces who were older than him. A lot. But he was the greatest amongst them, and they knew it. But he was the businessman. He traveled. He dressed nice. He had a nice house. The chitzayus of the Rebbe Marash was he tried to hide himself. When the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, Chabad was split. You know that. Chabad was divided up into 4 or 5 parts. And Lubavitch was the smallest of the 5. And it was all the Rebbe Marash's own fault. And here's the story. There was a woman who was either a sister-in-law or niece of the Rebbe Marash. She was related to him. The Rebbe Marash had a lot of money. The Rebbe Marash didn't, by the way, the Rebbe Marash never did one day of business. The Rebbe Marash pushed won lotteries. You know, if you have Ruach HaKodesh, you can win lotteries. He won a number of golf. He had a lot of money, but he never ever earned money. Huh?
He did stocks.
I can't hear.
He did stocks.
That's not true. He pushed one. By the time he passed away, he had all this expensive furniture. There wasn't a nickel in the house. The whole thing was a pneumistic thing. It says in the Rebbe's Rishimis that the Tzemach Tzedek used to buy lottery tickets, and the Rebbe Marash used to buy lottery tickets, and they found a pigeon nefesh from the Tzemach Tzedek. He bought a lottery ticket, and a lottery ticket then wasn't like today. It didn't cost $3. A lottery ticket costed $100, but you could win 10,000. Tzemach Tzedek wrote, "Yihiratzan sheyala aschus lebni Shmuel sheyichya." Tzemach Tzedek bought himself a lottery ticket. The Rebbe Marash bought a lottery ticket, and Tzemach Tzedek wrote a tefillah that his son should win and not him. It was an Inyan Pnimi. The whole business with Geld and the Rebbe Marash was an Inyan Pnimi. So people, huh?
Cheating.
Are you kidding? It's cheating. Are you kidding? It's cheating.
How is anyone else supposed to?
Anyway, because he only did it a few times. So people kept to borrow money from him. And he always acted like a regular guy. That was his thing. So this woman, who was either his sister-in-law or his niece, walks into his house. He and the Tzemach Tzedek lived in the same house. There was one building. It was separated by a door. The Rebbe Marash's wife, who was an incredible woman, Rebbe Tzedek, was home. And this woman says to her sister-in-law, to her aunt, "Where is Shmuel?" She called him by his first name. They were family. Where's Shmuel? So the Rebbe Tzedek is Ered Bam Shved. He's by the Tzemach Tzedek. So this woman, who was a family member, doesn't think twice, opens up the door that separates the Rebbe Marash's apartment from the Tzemach Tzedek's apartment, and walks to the apartment. It's the last months of the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek's life. It's Mamish, the end of his life. He's very ill. And she hears an argument. The Tzemach Tzedek says to the Rebbe Marash, "Sit down in my chair. Sit down in my chair." And the Rebbe Marash says, "I can't." Tzemach Tzedek says, "I am commanding you, sit down on my chair." And the Rebbe Marash says, "I can't." So he says, I'm your father, and I command you, sit down on my chair. And the Rebbe Marash says, I can't sit in your chair. So after saying this 5 or 6 times, the Tzemach Tzedek says, "If du willst dich nicht setzen auf mein Stuhl, wirst du leiden sollst. If you don't sit on my chair now, later you're going to suffer." And boy, did he suffer. And the Rebbe Marash says, "I can't." That's how the conversation is. And someone overheard it. And he walks out, he bumps right into her. In other words, the secret is out, that the Tzemach Tzedek crowned the Rebbe Marash as the next Rebbe. But he told him, if you don't want to suffer from your brother, you want politics, you're going to take it now. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, "I will not sit in your chair, I don't care what I pay." And his whole necessity, you know, when Rebbe Marash became a Rebbe in the beginning, he didn't have a minion. Everybody ran to the others. And it was his own fault. Why? Because, quote, he couldn't sit in his father's chair. So when the Rebbe Marash sees this lady, he says to her, "Du wirst mir weiter rufen, Shmuel, und keiner wird nicht wissen, was du hast da jetzt gehört. You're going to continue calling me Shmuel. Don't call me Reb, don't call me Reb, you call me Shmuel. And no one is allowed to know what you just heard." So she kept the secret until the Tzemach Tzedek passed away. And then she revealed it. And it's part of the drama that happened afterwards. So the combination of this, the Rebbe Marash was fearless. He literally brought the Russian government to its knees to end pogroms. There were pogroms in Russia. And in Russia, pogroms were organized from the top, from the Tsar, from the king himself. And they wouldn't even talk to him. So he went to Paris, he went to Berlin, went to all the Western capitals in Europe, and he met newspaper reporters, and there were big opinion pages in the international newspapers that the Russian government is making the Jewish people a korban. And there were big articles that the Western powers should cut off diplomatic and financial ties with Russia because how they're treating the Jews. So he went from capital to capital, and he got himself interviewed by big newspapers, and there was big articles saying that the Russians are being cruel to the Jews and we should punish Russia. And he got on a train and went straight back to Petersburg. When he showed up in Petersburg, the whole city was waiting to kill him. And he said, he met the minister of what we call the minister of state. He said, you know what you just did? You undermined the Russian government. And then I said, yeah, you know what? Jews are being murdered. You don't even give me an appointment. And I should sit and wait for you to find time for me? So the guy says to the Rebbe Marash, you know, you could lose your life over this. And the Rebbe Marash said, I'm not thinking about myself a minute. But, you know, the famous line, Jewish blood is not cheap. He said it first. And the pogrom stopped. The pogrom stopped. And on the other hand, he wouldn't sit in his father's chair because